5 hours from now, you have to let me go to the bathroom. Especially if I drink that bottle of water.
Yeah, right.
You can stick this on either side, whatever feels most comfortable to you.
I do this in church almost every Sunday morning.
And we'll just have this all on one file and go from there.
Okay, is that
I think that's
okay
fine.
for you?
Can you toss me my phone, Rosie?
Yes.
I might get some B-roll.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we can just leave this here just so you don't have to. Or maybe I can move it here so it doesn't get in your way. And do you mind just talking a little bit into the microphone to make sure we're picking up?
Greetings to everybody from Presque on this rainy morning. It looks very much like it did when I was a child. And sitting here in the kitchen at Presque in the Lighthouse and looking out onto the water's a nice gray, reflecting the sky, and the waves have white caps, and it sort of feels like home. As much as I love the beautiful, smooth lake, the white caps are far more what we saw a lot of. I see a white fence out there and I can see some nice greenery. The only thing I can't see is that there used to be a road out there. And when I was a child, there was a portion of that road still left. And that's where I learned to skate. It's where I learned to ride a bike. And it was just nice to have that flat area out there to play on. And then on the other side of the road, it went down to the lake. At each end of the concrete, that concrete had broken up. It used to be the main road, but when it broke up on either end, there were ways to get down into the water from the concrete. It was challenging for a kid. It was a nice place to climb around and have fun.
I'll just check the recording.
Okay. Is that enough?
Yeah.
Just want to make sure that it's picking up. I don't know if that mic's working. Like I was
This one.
saying, like you have to talk like right.
Enjoy.
I might just use my phone.
Yeah, that's fine. I actually don't need to sit here either. Let me try one more thing. How bad is this if we have this on too?
You ever move
Oh.
your apps around and you can't remember where you put them?
But there's, every once in a while I'll delete an app just because I haven't used it in 3 years,
Mm-hmm.
And then the next day I need it.
Right. You're like, oh, where did that go?
Oh gosh.
I think we'll just do it the
We'll do the
modern
phone
way.
notes.
We'll just, I'm just going to place my phone there and record on that.
Whoops.
If you feel comfortable with that.
Oh, that's fine. Do I have you just have to tell me if I'm too loud or too soft or
Oh, we could probably adjust that
Yeah.
in post.
Yeah.
in post-production.
Yes,
Yeah.
we're professionals.
Can't you tell?
I watch every once in a while. I'll see one of your pieces online, on Facebook. And depending on what's going on at the moment, sometimes I will watch it and sometimes I won't. I watched the one where you said it was a half bath down here. It was not a half bath, it was a whole bath.
A whole bath.
Oh, really? Oh, okay.
In a
I
half
sat
bath
there and
space.
and I went,
Yeah.
it was a whole bath.
Yeah.
And I thought,
you should totally
I should
comment.
call.
Yes, call, drop a comment.
Yeah.
See, I'm not accustomed to writing comments. I learned a long time ago that I don't like to deal with the results of writing a comment. I will comment, if I have written many Google reviews and all that stuff, but I only write if I can write positively. If I have a complaint or any correction or anything like that, I try not to do that because there will inevitably be someone who sees it a different way, and then I start an online argument. I don't need an online argument. I want it. I don't want people, I want to speak the truth and have people realize it's the truth, you know. And sometimes their truth is different than mine. They saw things differently. Certainly when my book first came out, I had a few people who said, I don't remember it ever being like that. And I said, well, you might have seen things from a different perspective. Remember, I was living right in the house, and remember, I was 5, 6, 7, 8 years old at the time that happened, and everybody has a little different perspective. I had the good fortune to have my parents involved. When I wrote the book, they each got an opportunity to read it before it was published. And they had just very few. Each one of them had 1 or 2 things that they said, now you might want to think about doing this instead of that, or you might want to say it differently. But for the most part, they agreed with everything that I wrote. Some families are storytellers and some families aren't. And when my family has always been storytellers. I mean, I think probably a lot of that comes from my paternal grandfather, because he was German and he was very much a storyteller. I remember that well. And from that, my 3 uncles had good stories. And then our family always did interesting things. Maybe not when I was a child, but my father always had bad boy stories to tell, and my uncle built GE plants, so he had work stories to tell. And my uncle Gordon was a meat cutter. Gordon's Quality Meat Market was his business. And so he always had stories about the customers and how the store grew and things like that. And that was just the whole family had stories to tell. And then, of course, when I started working, it was the nature of me to tell stories about my work and whatever. And then when I got married, I married a man who had 9 brothers and sisters, and that family had stories, amazing stories. Some of my sister-in-laws had lived all over the world with their military husbands, and even the people who had lived in Erie from the family had stories to tell. That just the whole family, it all morphed into being a storytelling family. My daughter can tell some great stories, and my grandchildren, they tell, well, the boys not so much, but my 15-year-old granddaughter she is very theatrical, and she can tell stories. She does a lot of improv work, and she loves on stage improv. And then she also writes, and so she can write stories too.
What prompted you to write Lightkeeper's Legacy?
As a child, my father recognized through my schoolwork and through the things that I just regularly wrote that I had a way with words. I mean, I could express myself fairly well. And he always said, well, living here is a real different experience, and there aren't many children that get this kind of good fortune. You really should write about living at the Lighthouse, because there are so many things that have happened. And he shared with me, I mean, he would have things happen at work that I was perhaps too young to know about or go to, but he would talk about it. And then every day at lunchtime, he would bring his crew of 3 men home to have lunch in the living room here, in the kitchen here at the Lighthouse. And so when these men would come home with him, they would talk about what they did during the day, and I would hear the stories there. Meeting unusual people, the people he worked with. He even had some interns that were very interesting, including Governor Tom Ridge, long before he was governor, was one of my father's interns. But my father was my primary encouragement to do this. My mother was the person who said, you need to sit down and do this. And she said it often. She agreed with my dad that would be a good legacy to leave. And so when computers, now remember that I have aged during the time of computer development. And so when I finally reached the stage where I had my own computer, where I could cut and paste and write without too much difficulty, I sat down and did this. I took 6 months off work and just enjoyed that freedom to do the research, first of all, because I had to spend a lot of time at the public library, a lot of time on Presque going through their records and looking at a lot of artifacts, things like that, and finally getting a sense of what I wanted to write about. I wrote chapter by chapter, so I worried about the book not flowing very well because I did specific chapters, but it ended up flowing sufficiently for people to understand the story. It was a fun job writing it, and I learned a great deal and really kind of grew into my ability to write.
Can you talk a little bit about how your family came to live at the Lighthouse?
Long before I was born, when my father was growing up in Erie, he was what they call a bay rat. And I don't know if you've ever heard that phrase before, but there are other men, probably not anymore because my father would be almost 100 years old now, but this group of men who loved being on the bayfront. They had small boats that they would take out into the bay, and it's a wonder they didn't drown because they were, small boats, not real boats. And they liked to hunt and fish. There were a lot of commercial fishing businesses along the bayfront, and they would hire you for a day to help with the fishing or to clean the fish. So boys that were 7, 8, 9, 10 years old could actually spend the day along the bay. They got to know all these fishermen. They got to know what life on water was like. My father loved that. That was his way of being. His mom and dad had words to say about it sometimes, but he really grew up loving that kind of life. And throughout his life, he was always a hunter and a fisherman. But when he and my mom got married, they lived in the 4th Ward, Lower West Side of Erie. And my mother, like any woman, wanted a nice home, start with a nice apartment, evolve into a nice home, evolve into a nicer home. My father said, well, wouldn't it be nice to just live near the lake, My mother said, well, if that nice home is near the lake. But through my father's connections here on the park, and he spent a lot of time on the park as a young man, he found out that the 9th Coast Guard District had put the lighthouse up for rent. In 1956, when they early 55, when they inspected it, they realized that the lighthouse was becoming worn down. It hadn't been lived in since 1948, when the last Coast Guard family left. And at that time, the Coast Guard had declared it too primitive to live in. And so it was empty. The Coast Guard Auxiliary would hold meetings here, but the house wasn't cared for. And the best thing to do would be to rent to someone who would take care of it. And so my mom and dad came and looked through it, and it was the kind of a home. It was big enough that they thought it was a good place to raise a child. My father was happy on the water, all that. So they decided that they would rent it. But the real kicker in deciding to rent it was the fact that it was 1955 and the rent was $25 a month. And they thought they could afford that. And indeed they could. Shortly after we began to live here, my father got a job with the Department of Forest and Waters, working here on the park as the maintenance foreman. And so he would roll out of bed at 6:45, and he could be at work by 7 with no problem at all. And he could bring the crew home for lunch. They got inside out of the sun or inside out of the cold. It was a pleasant way for him to carry on his work life. Now, that said, it wasn't as pleasant for my mother, who, if she wanted to go anywhere, had to drive 7 miles to get to a store, or to take me to school, or to go visit friends, go to church, whatever. It was a drive. One nice thing that happened is that the Coast Guard people had, at that time, had many families living on the Coast Guard station, and they had 2 or 3 big homes, one duplex, one regular, that had families living there. And so when Coast Guardsmen were assigned to be here at Erie, many times they could bring their wives and children. So they always had a van that went up the hill. We called it up the hill every day for school. And they said, well, we can stop and pick up Loretta too. And so I would walk out to the road before school, or at the time they were going by, and I always had a ride to school. It was especially nice when it snowed a lot. My mom appreciated that, and there was only 1 year. 2nd grade was the only year that there wasn't a child that was going to my school. I went to Tracy School when it was still at 12th and Peninsula. And there wasn't any children that year, and so my mom had to drive me, and it worked pretty well, except for one time when we had a Ford Ranchero and my mom was driving it, and we started up the hill. It was icy, and she couldn't make it, so she backed down, and she tried again, didn't make it, so she backed down again. And the 3rd time she got up there and she really gunned it, did 3 or 4 big donuts, and was facing back down the hill, and she said, I think you're going to miss school today. So, living in the Lighthouse, it was the kind of life my parents thought would be a good one for themselves and for me.
Do you think that proved to be true?
No, I would say that I would never advise any family with children to live out here in an isolated situation like I was. I was an only child, and I was raised as an adult, pretty much. My parents treated me like an adult. I was allowed to read whatever I wanted. When adults came to the home, I was allowed to sit in on the conversation, keep my mouth shut, I had 3 Chesapeake Bay Retriever dogs that I loved, and they were like siblings to me. And if I needed to be, how can I say this? If I needed to be a little kid, the dogs would let me be a little kid. But basically, I didn't have a real childhood probably until I got married. And my husband was still a kid when we got married, and he had a child. He was still living his childhood dreams, and he included me in a lot of them. First times I did a lot of things after I got married that I hadn't done as a child, including getting muddy, dirty, wet, swimming in the creek, and things that he and his brothers and sisters did often.
So how did you spend most of your days here at the Lighthouse?
Well, I would get up in the morning and have breakfast, and then my mom would send me to get dressed. And getting dressed was a longer deal because I could play while I get dressed. My mother wasn't necessarily watching right over me. The dogs would play, we'd tease, and for a while I had some interesting pets. I had a raccoon and a deer, and sometimes while I was getting dressed, I could spread the morning out for quite a long time. And this is when I was younger. My mother, almost every day, she baked something or cooked something that had to have prep work. So I learned to prep for making things. And I also loved when my mother made cookies. Now, And I can safely say it was pretty much every day, because there are two reasons for that. First of all, once the cookies were made, my mother would load up a few dozen, and she'd put it in a box or bag and fill a thermos of coffee and say, here, get on your bicycle ride. Your dad's working over at Waterworks. Ride up to Waterworks. Here's 10 o'clock break for the crew. And so they'd stop and they'd have cookies and thermos, and then thermos of coffee, and then I'd ride back with the stuff. And it was an interesting way to see where my dad was working and to learn the parts of the park too. I knew where everything was. One of my favorite places to take cookies to was back in the ponds. At one time, they were building docks, metal pylons with concrete docks back in the ponds. And so I'd have to ride around a little bit to figure out. I'd finally be going, hello, Daddy, are you there? You know, because I'd have to find out where they were. And that was just a different, experience. So cooking was, especially baking was a big part of it. My grandmother lived with us for 4 years after my grandfather died. She also was an amazing baker. And she didn't make cookies. She made good old-fashioned sweetbreads. She was Swedish, and I still use her recipes for sweetbreads, but she would make 3 or 4 dozen sweet rolls at a time. And I could kill a dozen sweet rolls in a day's time. And I think back and think, I wish we had, in the 1950s and 60s, been more knowledgeable about nutrition, because I would never let a kid eat a dozen sweet rolls. But, my grandmother, she liked that I enjoyed her baking, And I have a sweet tooth, and that's where I came from, I suppose. My father had it too, so.
When you and your family moved in, I know you had said it was vacant for a while and needed a lot of repair. So can you explain a little bit more what that looked like and what sort of alterations or updates happened to the house while you were living here?
When I was living here. Well, when we first moved in, the chandelier was falling off in the dining room, and the paint was peeling off the walls. They had linoleum on the kitchen floor and in the front hall floor, and our dogs eventually ate most of the linoleum, bringing us down to a nice wooden floor that recently the Lighthouse board has remodeled, or not remodeled, but sanded and refinished. But most of the time we had a rug of some sorts on the floors. That was just tradition of that particular era. We had one rug that had been my grandmother's, and it had, I remember this, it had a black edging all around it, and it was in the dining room. And it went almost to the edge of the dining room. And on that black edge, it was always covered with dog hair, because we had Chesapeake Bay Retrievers, and they shed nice little curly hairs all over the place. So my father, of course, fixed the chandelier. A lot of painting had to be done. And thank heavens the Coast Guard provided us with paint. They had multiple colors. You could get pink, you could get green, you could get blue, you could get brown, and you could get gray and white. And so we started out with those colors, and our rooms, the dining room and kitchen became brown. And then my mother and father apparently realized that you could mix white with brown and get more of a tan color, In our bedrooms, mine was pink, my parents' was green. But again, the colors were very vivid. They were military color, they were used in military housing. And so my mother would take the white and make it so that it was a little more like a regular home. But we painted constantly. Painting the floor gray, we did that quite often. The wainscoting sometimes was gray and sometimes it was white. Trying to think of other changes. Of course, we didn't have a lot of money to make the kind of changes people would make in a house today if you were buying and you wanted to reconstruct or remodel. My father could always find a hammer and nail to fix something, or our back door, we had to put a couple of safety things on the back door because the dogs could go through the screen door and get out the back door. And so he put in extra, I forget what kind of locks you call them, but you just stick the end in. And certainly out front the same way. Because people did come to the house and ask, if they could go through the lighthouse. And we wanted to make sure nobody could just walk in. I remember one of the things that was not usable when we moved in was the back porch off of the kitchen door. And it looked like maybe you could walk there, but my father said, no, don't do that. It's not solid and it won't be safe, so please just don't go in there. He said, I'll fix it when I can get to it, Well, we moved out 10 years later, and it was even worse than it was when we moved in. He didn't either take the time or have the time to fix it. So I never was able to go out the back door, but we kept it open on nice days so the air came into the kitchen. But that back porch never really got repaired until the Lighthouse board again took the money and time to fix it, and now it's a nice back porch.
What about the grounds and outbuildings? Were any of the outbuildings still here when you moved in?
Oh, yes. Well, of course, the oil house was there, and you would never take an oil house away from a lighthouse because that is the very essence of what a lightkeeper does. A tender would come and bring oil, and it was stored in the oil house so that it didn't catch fire and burn anything else. And every day the lightkeeper went out to get oil from the oil house. But in addition to that, in the back corner of the fenced-in area of the lighthouse, there was a garage, and it wasn't a huge garage. It would have held one car, and then about 20 feet west of or north of that was what we called the wash house. Now, I didn't call it the wash house, but Bill Huntington and his family, the last lighthouse keeper who lived here, he and his brothers and sisters called it the wash house because that's where Mrs. Huntington kept her wringer washing machine. And he had fond memories of, turning the wringer. But in the corner of that wash house was a little room with the door and a 2-seater outhouse. And that was, when I first moved in, that was kind of a surprise. My parents, we showed me around the house when we visited, but but my mother and father didn't show me a bathroom. And I didn't think about it until we were on our way home. And I said, Mommy, where's the bathroom in that house? And she said, well, it's in a special place out in the back of the house. And you'll get to be outside when you... Outside? It was kind of unusual, but I got used to it. And for 2 years, until we built the bathroom my father built the bathroom in the lighthouse, we used the outdoors, even in the wintertime. We had the traditional Sears catalog, all that. The garage was filled. I distinctly remember this, and I wish that building were still there. It was torn down in 1962. The Coast Guard put out a contract to tear it down, and my father and one of his friends bid on the contract and received the contract, so they tore it down for the Coast Guard. But at the time we moved in, it was had a lot of shelving, and the shelving had lots of bottles. They were small bottles, and it looked like chemicals to me. I remember thinking, I wonder what's in there. And of course, the first thing my father said was, don't touch any of that. So I didn't touch any of it. Well, that's not true. I didn't always pay attention, but I didn't hurt myself. There were tools out there that would have been appropriate for the light keeper to clean the light and to polish the brass, and lots of information. There was written information too about caring for the light. Obviously, it was where the lightkeeper kept, it was his garage. It was where he kept all of the things that it took to keep the light in good shape. I think my father enjoyed knowing and using some of those things, but they disappeared as I was a child, you know. And one thing that we did do with the garage is we had the opportunity to get a commercial freezer for free, the kind that would be in a grocery store. And so my father accepted it, and it lived out there. We kept frozen food in it, if it was more than what would fit in our Frigidaire, you know. And then anytime my father would shoot a deer or hunt or have wild game, if he couldn't get it cleaned up and taken care of right away, it went in the freezer until he got to it. So the garage was useful too, but those were the outbuildings: the garage and the outhouse and the oil house. There was no, in the early days, before the, how can I say this? The road did not come out to the lighthouse on the south side until about 1947. Until then, there was not an easy way to get to the lighthouse. But once it came out, then they developed a driveway that would go around the lighthouse, would come out on the piece of concrete that was still out from the old Lakeside Road, and then it would drive around to the garage. So in the early 40s, the Huntingtons could put their car back there and in the garage. We never could. My father tried a couple of times, but inevitably he would get stuck in the sand. The road was eroding so that sand was prevalent, so you just couldn't. It was pointless. We always parked right outside the fence in front of the house.
Did you ever meet any of the Huntingtons?
Yes. When I wrote my book, I had the opportunity to meet Bill Huntington and his wife, who spent many hours with me talking about their life here. It was a different life for them than it was for me, because there were 5 siblings, and as was usual in families of that time, the girls helped their mom. They had a garden. They had a lot more farming type things than we did. But of course, Mr. and Mrs. Huntington especially, was more like that. And she did a lot of cooking. She had 5 kids. So the girls worked in the kitchen with their mom and like that. The boys would talk about going out to roam the lighthouse, or not the lighthouse, but roam Presque. One of their favorite things to do was go over to the sawmill, which is easy walking distance. And Ted and Emma Leopold were children that lived over there. And they would go and hang around with Ted and Emma. I'm sure Emma came over to see the girls too. So they did have other children. It was like a neighborhood if you walked that far. The boys loved being on the water, but they didn't go so much on the lake. They would go into the bay, and they would go into the lagoons. There was a large canoe house over there, and they would go there, and that was a concession of DCNR, then it was Department of Forest and Waters. And so different people would have that concession every year, but that's where they rented out boats, rowboats. People could kayak or canoe through the lagoons. No kayaks yet. And the boys would go over there, and men would catch fish, and they'd hire the boys to clean the fish. Things that boys like to do, you know. So the Huntington children had a much different experience here than I did. They had dogs and pets and stuff, but they had other kids to play with where I didn't have that.
Are there any sort of like notable events growing up here that kind of stick out in your mind? I know you detail a lot of them in your book. One that I really enjoy is your story about, I think it was Inky who got into the strawberry pie. And
Well, my mother canned and women of that era. You know, every time you got a peck of strawberries, a peck of tomatoes, a bushel of tomatoes, whatever, you fired up the stove and you canned. Every woman had the big, I think it's a 26-gallon canner, you know, and that was another thing I remember helping my mom with a lot in the mornings. But I lost the question.
Any sort of notable,
Notable
events or anything that just sticks out in your mind?
The animals, okay, but a lot of times my mother would also freeze strawberries, fruit, things that she could freeze. And of course we had the commercial refrigerator or commercial freezer in the garage. So she would freeze strawberries, you know, all summer. And so we would have them all year long. And if she had people for dinner, a standard dessert was strawberry shortcake, and she would make the shortcake, of course. And so one night we were having a wonderful wild game dinner. We had frog's legs. Now that's something that you can get out of the lagoons. I don't know anymore, but my father would go frogging, and they called it gigging because you had to spear the frogs. And there's like a trident spear that you would get them with. And so we had frogs, pheasant, quail, goose, ducks, of course. I mean, my father was a tremendous duck hunter, and between October and December, you know, as long as you could get on the water and it wasn't frozen, you went duck hunting. That was just a standard thing. And this was part of the migratory flyway for the ducks of this region, or the ducks that, you know, went north to south and south to north. And so it was not unusual to have many, many ducks in the freezer ready to go. So they would cook big dinners like that and invite 3 or 4 couples to come. And I was always, people never brought their children, but I had to eat. So they would just sit me next to my mother, and I'd go, you know, I want more of this, I want more of this, or, ew, I have to eat that, you know. Although I did pretty good at eating all of those things. But the strawberry shortcake was the dessert, and that was quite an event when my mother walked into the kitchen to clear the table and found the raccoon digging in the strawberry bowl. And so the plates flew, and the raccoon went back to live in the wild.
So you've, in your book, you definitely, I think, detail a lot of the lighthouse history, and you delve a little bit into the history of Presque and how that's evolved over time for Erie County residents. Are there parts of the story you think that still need to be told, or other sections you wish you could delve a little bit deeper into and just didn't have the resources at the time?
I wish that I had. After my book was published, there were several people who came out to me and said, you know, oh, we spent a lot of time on Presque and we did this and that, or I knew your dad and this is one of the things that we did, you know, and it would be a story that I had not heard yet. And often I wish that those people had come to me sooner, but that's okay. The book is published. My book was never meant to be the end of what got published about the Lighthouse and Presque Isle. It was meant to be a beginning. And hopefully people would continue to question what happened. And if someone can show that there was more to it than what I wrote, I would be very happy to have that enlarged. The experience of living on Presque, everybody who lived here, all of the 11 keepers and then the Coast Guard people that came after that, and the renters, had their own experiences, and it was different for everybody. You have to remember that in the mid-1800s, the lighthouse was, there was no lighthouse, but the Presque Isle wasn't Presque Isle, it was just Isle. There was no, it was a complete island. And if you wanted to get over here, you had to have a rowboat or some kind of a boat to get over here. And a lot of times there was a lot of writing about church groups that would have their summer picnics over here, and families would bring row their children over, and they would have nice picnics. Also in the near the lagoons, there's an area that was a cranberry bog, and up until people discovered that, you could go in and pick some cranberries, and that was a nice crop. But within a year or two after people discovered that and started talking, it got in the newspaper and people were more public about it, a company that actually did cranberry canning or use came in and raked the cranberries, and when you do that, you ruin the plant. And so the cranberries there weren't any for many years. Now, if you go back in there, you may find a few again, but you wouldn't find like they did back in the mid-1800s. But every experience of coming out here was different because many times you couldn't get here by road. The first road that came, the first road was actually built in 1921, so there was sand that came over and you could build on it, and people could go by foot or by car or whatever. But prior to that, it was a little iffy. You could walk over, and many people did to use the beach. And the people of Erie, when it came time to make this a state park, the people of Erie felt very strongly about Presque Isle. They felt that it was Erie's, they owned it. Erie owned Presque Isle. They felt this was their place and that they needed to have it and they wanted it. And so when a board was chosen this was named a state park, and of course it had to have an advisory board, and that advisory board said, well, this is lovely. The state said that they would give us $25,000. It was either 25 or 50. I'd have to look in my book to remember. But the state would give so much money, but the citizens of Erie had to match that money to have control, or to make it into a state park. And the citizens it didn't take 5 days, And of course, on the board were people like Anna Strong, who her father was a congressman. She had big money, and had some big houses around town. And she, of course, knew people. And gathering money in those days was not a hard thing to do. It was done by word of mouth. They didn't have a campaign or anything like that. So it very quickly, the city made sure that everybody knew that they wanted Presque Isle right here, and they did it by giving money.
So there's Presque Isle and the Lighthouse have definitely evolved over time, from the lightkeepers to
renters,
residents,
right.
and now we're nonprofit. It's a museum,
making it available to the public so people can see, and trying to teach children about it. One of the things that's important for Erie, and I say it's important for Erie. I don't live in Erie anymore. I live in Savannah, Georgia, but Erie has such a place in maritime history, given Oliver Hazard Perry and where he built his flagships and his fleet so that he could fight in the War of 1812. That history plus the history of Presque Isle, the lighthouse, and all of the things that were done to make this a place that boaters and other people and swimmers and everybody could come. And there's even more history back on the land area where the Soldiers and Sailors Hospital was built. There was a Marine base for a little while. One congressman got us nitty, but he wanted it to be the Marines. And this is back in the 1860s, 70s back there. Didn't last long, but there's a strong maritime history component to the city. And so it's very important for this to be part of the city, part of Erie, and it gives Erie a claim to fame that keeps people coming. One of my friends, Jackie Tamaro, got interested in having schools do raise money for the lighthouse, to help build the lighthouse in the beginning. And she had a penny campaign where students would bring in pennies to help start the process of upgrading the lighthouse or improving it. And she paired our students here in Erie with students in Scituate, Massachusetts, which also has a pretty nice lighthouse. And so the students worked together. And it was a learning process, not only about the maritime history, but also that other places had lighthouses too. And children the history of lighthouses might seem, if you only have one lighthouse to see, it seems very minimal. But if you understand that there were hundreds and hundreds of lighthouses throughout the United States, very important from 1789 all the way up to today, and that those lighthouses saved a lot of lives, those light keepers saved a lot of lives. And there's one other part of that too that still lives closely in my heart. The light keepers, there was considered a sacred trust between the light keepers and the people who traveled on the water. The light keepers felt it was their sacred duty to make sure that those people on the water were safe. And there's a lot of meat there for sermons. In fact, I have written a sermon for my church. I gave a sermon about the importance of caring for others, and that was one way to do it, the sacred duty that lives in each of us to take care of other people. And that comes for the children too. They need to learn that too. And that's another way just to enhance that, you don't live here for yourself. You live here to help others. Yeah.
When people come to visit the lighthouse, and we have visitors from all over the world, what do you hope, if they walk away knowing or feeling one thing, what do you hope that is?
I hope that they walk away with a sense of the relationship between the light keeper and the ships on the lake, and understanding that this was a fluid building, that the tower had to be raised. It started out in 1872 with blueprints, but it grew, and the lights changed, the height of the tower changed. The people who lived here, their family life changed because they were here. So it isn't just a lighthouse that sits here and everybody looks at it. It's a place where families lived, light keepers did their work. There was a lot of work to it. And it was not the only lighthouse. It was one of many, many in the United States. And it required a certain type of work that lighthouse keepers had to be trained for. I mean, it was, you didn't go to college to be a lighthouse keeper, but you did have to be trained and apprenticed before you got a chance to do that work.
So it's very clear that, Presque Lighthouse has a lot of meaning to you and your family. Could you just go, explain that a little more? Like, what exactly does it mean to your family? What's your idea of the lighthouse?
Well, of course, my mom and dad are long gone now, but for them, for my father, it meant being able to live out his dreams. He really loved living out here. And when we had to move away, it was because his work had changed a little bit, and he wanted to open a store. But for my mother, it was not quite as wonderful. She loved the animals, having strange pets. She loved being outdoors. But she was not a swimmer. The water was not as meaningful to her. And I think she would have liked a more normal life. Now, the other people in my family, my uncles and aunts, loved coming out here. And when you say, how did it mean to the family? The people who lived on Presque Isle became a family. I had, like immediate ties, but with no siblings, I couldn't really talk about that. But my aunts and uncles loved it, and the Presque Isle police, the park police, the men who came and worked to make sure everything operated well on the park, they would come by and visit, and they were part of our family. The Coast Guard, this is a good one, the Coast Guard guys, once every 10 days, 2 weeks, 2 young men from the Coast Guard station would come over, and of course the Coast Guard was responsible for the light itself, and so they would come over and they'd check all the batteries and make sure everything was working properly. And my mom in the beginning would see them coming, and she'd go out and she'd see that who was there, and she said, now before you leave, you come and see me, and I have some cookies, and so when the guys came over, they always could get cookies. Well, by the time the third or fourth visit that I can remember, they would knock on the door and say, Mrs. Wunch, we're here and we're almost done. And she'd say, oh, I'll put the coffee on and the cookies are ready. So the Coast Guard became part of our family too. And because they drove me back and forth to school, and my father was acquainted with the chief over there and the bosun's mate. I forget what their people were, but they always had 2 or 3 people at the top that my father would work with and visit with. So they were part of the family, and the fellas that worked at the sawmill down the road, Joe Desser he was my father's supervisor, so to speak. I feel sorry for him if he tried to supervise my dad. but Joe Desser would come to the house. Dan Descanio, who was the head of the park police, he would come have coffee, and he and his wife too. I mean, they would come for meals. Trying to think who else was important in the general gist of living on the park. You just had people that became part of the family. And all of those people, if I ever saw them out somewhere, or they saw me without my parents, and they'd say, you look just like your mother. And how are your parents doing? I got a lot of that. And later in my career, I worked for Penn State, Erie, and when they were starting to build Knowledge Park, we had a lot of building dedications and new programs and things like that. And it was at the time when Tom Ridge was our governor. Well, Tom Ridge had been my dad's intern, and he had come here and had lunch in the kitchen with everybody else. And so, and I got to know him. He was a few years older than me, but not a whole lot. And we had, he would tease me and stuff like that. But he remembered my parents very well. And I never saw him at a Penn State event, and it was quite often. I would never see him without him saying to me, and how are your parents? And when I told him that my father had died, it was, he was unhappy. It was like losing a part of your childhood or your youth. And I don't think I saw him after my mother died, but, and then of course I got to know Michelle Ridge as well, because I worked in the public library for a little while out in Mill Creek, but then when I went to work at Gannon, she was also at the public library over on Perry Square. So I got well acquainted with Michelle too, and they were lovely people, just lovely.
You were here for the transfer of the Lighthouse, right?
Yes, in 1998, the General Services Administration still had the overall responsibility for the lighthouse, the accounting for the expense of it and its maintenance and all that. And through Tom Ridge, he was able to work as a congressman. He was a congressman by then. He was able to work with the General Services to transfer that to the Lighthouse Board, and that's really when, I can't remember if it's the Lighthouse Board or DCNR, but it came to local control, and then we could begin with the renovations and rebuilding and reconstruction, or re-energizing of the lighthouse. I forget, when you write grants, there's always a word that you can't say because they won't fund it if you say that word. And it's been a while since I had to write a grant, so I can't remember.
What's
No, you're good. Still doing it. I think it turned.
yeah? Just.
Okay. I was like,
And we're
Yeah, I kind of wiggled in my seat a few times.
well, we're low on.
I thought he
our
was.
professional setup.
I thought he was going to tell me that he hadn't turned the camera on yet.
No, we're just low on batteries there, so I'll get the rest on this.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything else you wanted to speak about? Because I think
You pretty much covered it. Do you want to? My name is Loretta Ann Brandon. My maiden name was Loretta Ann Wunch. Where do you currently live? I live.
just sitting in state.
Yeah, I live in Savannah, Georgia, and what's the other one?
Tell
Please
us a
tell
little
us.
about yourself.
As a result of growing up in the Lighthouse, I am an avid reader. In fact, I'm what you would call a bibliophile. I have many books in my house, and I'm always looking to acquire more. I advise people on books to read, and that's one of the things that I'm doing right now is while I'm here. Both of the people that I'm staying with are great readers, and so I'm giving them lists of what would be good. I love reading, and so that's probably my favorite thing. I am a graduate of McDowell High School, Allegheny College, Gannon University for my master's. And I have worked at a variety of places, several libraries, both public and academic. And then at Gannon, I worked in the library and also in the development office, corporate and foundation relations. And then at Penn State, I was involved in public information. It was a challenge. That happened during when 9/11 happened while I was doing that. And many of our Penn State professors were able to make good comments on the engineering structures of buildings and how they collapse. And that was a busy day. I worked at Penn State, and then after my husband passed away, my daughter and her husband had decided to move to Savannah after they were married. And it became clear that because she was my only child, that's really where I needed to be. And so I found a job in Statesboro, Georgia, at Georgia Southern University. And so I worked for 10 years at Georgia Southern, and actually it was closer to 11. And then I retired from there. After I worked at Georgia Southern, I also took some freelance writing jobs, but I found that the older I got, the harder it was to sit in the chair for 8 hours and concentrate. I couldn't quite do that. One of my favorite jobs was working for an online website called WorthPoint, and it's an antiques evaluation site. And that was my mother's, after my parent, I didn't talk about my parents being divorced in 1972, I think. And so my mother created a whole new career for herself in the later years, and she owned Marion's Next to New, which was a consignment store, and she actually dealt in antiques. And so my work on Worth Point was sort of a continuation of my mother's interest in antiques and jewelry and dishes, things like that.
That's great. Unless there's anything else you want to speak about, I feel like
No.
we've got a pretty good
Okay.
history. I really enjoy hearing it
Oh, well,
in person.
yeah, you sit there with a smile on your face, and I'm trying to think, does she like what I'm saying? Or is she always a smiler? Or do I have a nose hair hanging out?
No, I like hearing it. No, it's my way. I'm a talker, so I was trying to keep it shut, so we could just get your words.
Yeah.
I was trying not to laugh a couple of times, because I didn't want
The
my
frogs.
like included. Yeah.
I know you said that. I was like, I have to keep it in, but that is so funny.
Yeah.
Well, there's another side to the frog story too, is that you go out in a canoe and you take a load of, I'm going to say TNT, and it's not that, dynamite, whatever. My father was knowledgeable enough to get the right amount of whatever it was. And you just drop it off the boat into the pond. And then all the frogs, the frogs die and they come up to the top.
I know our next light bite.
Yeah, right. Do you have any left over? Do you want to go fishing, frogging
Yeah,
with us?
what'd you call it?
Gigging.
Gigging. Well, that's specifically with the fork
With
thing,
the
right?
trident.
With the-
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Which was that was the legal way to do it.
Oh, okay.
The illegal way was the dynamite.
Sure, yeah.
Now, that said, one of my husband's dearest friends used to fish that way. And he was, my husband was a bricklayer, and so was this guy. He was a carpenter bricklayer. And he went out one weekend with his brothers, and, he threw a load of dynamite over and he didn't let go in time. And he lost both hands.
Oh my God.
And, that was I can't, and this is, I'm married and my husband is working as a contractor, and everything. And I'm thinking, oh my Lord. And, which it was one of the Luciano brothers. But anyway,
Oh my gosh.
I thought, and he was engaged to be married too, which is another part of it.
Oh.
Well, fortunately, he came from a family that had resources, and as the years passed, Herbie would tell me, oh yeah, I saw him, he was here or there, and he went into his dad's business where he could work, either computer work or sales or, in a construction way. And then one time I was in the grocery store, and this man who was, he had prostheses, and they were workable prostheses. He was bagging groceries with them, not very carefully, but, and he was with his wife. And I looked and I thought, that's Billy. Oh, what's Billy? What's Billy's last name? Dang, I can't remember. He lived on Lee Road. Oh. But anyway, I said, I wonder if that could be Billy. And finally, I just got my guts in order and went over and said, are you Billy? And he said, yeah. And I said, well, I'm Mrs. Herbie. And he said, Mrs. Herbie Brandon? And I said, yeah. And he said, oh my God, and he gave me a big hug, And he told me about, they got married, and they're still married. He had kids, and his life went along okay. But,
Wow.
and of course, with the changes in technology, of course, he
yeah.
would have a lot of opportunity. But no, that's a bad way to go fishing. And he learned, and boys are like that. I mean, he was still a boy. I was 21, 22, 23 years old, but he was a boy. That's the thing about men. They don't ever grow up until they get old enough where their hair starts going and they get a pot belly, and then they realize they're old, and they start acting their age for a change.
I don't plan to ever, just so you know.
You don't. Wow.
Can't compare.
I hate to tell you, take a good look at your mother's aunts and uncle, your mother's family. You got any bald uncles?
Every single one.
Oh no.
And they were all bald by 30 though.
Oh.
Yeah. Well, are you
Yeah.
30? Yeah.
I'm 37.
Okay, so you may have hit the jackpot. You may have hit the genetic jackpot.
Wow.
So,
Yeah.
You say goodbye to your ponytail.
Yeah. It'll go when it's ready.
well, I had my hair cut off last year in the spring because I had to have my hip replaced. And I couldn't picture myself. I had hair as long as Dom's, and it was all white. And I couldn't picture myself washing that head of hair with having to be careful in the shower and all that. And so I just said, oh, what the hey. And this is what my hair was this length most of my life, simply because when I was working, I didn't have the time to fuss with it. When you have long hair, well, you know.
Oh,
you guys both
yeah.
know.
For men, I do feel like it's a little bit cheating because for the male hairstyles that are shorter, it actually takes me more time because it's like more product and stuff like that. But for this, brush, ponytail, done.
Yeah.
And it's quicker.
Well, I went through those years too. When I was in college, I grew my hair out. Well, the real fun was I decided to grow my hair out. I was still coloring my hair, and it was an ashy brown kind of when I colored it. And I said, I think I'm just going to let my hair grow out. And my husband said, well, that's fine, because I was going every week every 6 weeks, and I should have gone every 4 weeks to have it colored. And it's expensive, so I let it grow out. And it was white, and it went back about that far. And finally he said, what are you going to do with that? And I said, oh, you don't like my high forehead? It was all white. And he said, well, you gotta, and I said, okay. So the next time I went, I let her cut it short. Of course, I came home and it was all gray. And then he was okay with that. What was the other thing? Oh, when I was in high school, I had hair. I kept my hair longer at some times, but not real long. But I had a streak that I had 2 streaks. One was bigger, one was smaller. And it went straight back from here. So whenever I wore my hair pulled straight back, I'd have those 2 little streaks. And when I got into college, people would say to me, how do you do those 2 streaks, And I'd say, oh, it's just natural, But when I got a little older, and the women that were asking me where did you get those 2 streaks? They used to say, it's a long drive, but when it starts to not look just right, I said, I drive down to Pittsburgh. There's a guy named Victor down in Shadyside, and I go there and I spend the day because he's a real nice guy, and they do my nails and my toes, and they put my streaks back in, hair by hair. That's it's hard for me not to tell stories like that. My husband's family was very humorous. I didn't really get like this until I got married. When I was younger, I was a little more shy and backward, but And now, today I walk into church and they say, "Oh, the preacher isn't here today. Can you help?" And people expect that of me because I've done it for a long time, and I'm getting old enough where I don't think they should expect it of me anymore. They should let me be an old lady.